So while I was on holiday, being basked in 34-degree Greek sunshine, I couldn't help but think about all the different mechanics Pokemon will never print again.
Because trust me, there is a few. Grab a drink and let me tell you all about it. Right, now this is one I think the format needs desperately, because you've got abilities like Psychic Embrace just going absolutely unchecked. And it's complete madness.
But I see the YouTube comment you're furiously typing at me now. We do have ability locking format. Don't worry, I'll get there. Gone are the days of Garbodor and Hexmaniac. Garbodor is the poster child of universal ability lock. Both the Dragons Exalted and Breakpoint Garbodors had the exact same ability. Garbotoxin. As long as this Garbodor has a tool card attached, all other abilities apart from Garbotoxin get turned off. Pokemon TCG is normally ran by powerful abilities like Blastoise's Deluge, Gardevoir EX's Psychic Embrace, or even Lugia V-Star's Summoning Star. Garbotoxin turns them all off.
This was, and probably still is, at least in my opinion, some of the best ability lock ever printed.
And has been the focal point of many top tier decks like Zoro Garbodor, a deck that actually won the World Championships. This deck would utilise Zoroark's trade ability to draw a ton of cards and then activate Garbodor by attaching a Klefki. Klefki was a card that would effectively turn itself into a tool card only for your opponent's turn. It did make the Pokemon it was attached to immune to damage for Mega Pokemon, but that was really irrelevant, to be honest. All we needed to do was have it attached to Garbodor for your opponent's turn, so they couldn't use abilities, and then coming back into your turn, it would discard itself, so you could use trade some more. Golisopod GX and Garbodor. This actually got second place at the World Championships too, making efficient use of Golisopod GX's attack, like First Impression, which would do 120 damage for one energy card, while also ability locking your opponent at the same time with Garbotoxin, making cards like Acerola, which would completely heal any damage of Golisopod, and Guzmas, meaning you could hit exactly what you want when you wanted, really deadly. Buzzgarb, a deck that saw success back in the Sun and Moon era. It utilised Buzzwole GX to fire off scary jet punches to wreck evolution decks by sniping them while I was on the bench, and Absorption GX for fast KOs too, all while denying abilities with Garbotoxin, a very scary rush deck. Drampergarb, this is probably the best deck in format for a while, to be honest. Berserk was one of the most easiest 180 damage attacks I've ever seen. Back when 180 damage was actually a really good number to hit, all things considered. Righteous Edge would also discard special energy, and Garbodor would again lock down your opponent's abilities. This actually won an IC with Tord Reckless at the helm and was a big force to be reckoned with. There was even a sort of off variant of this deck, Espeon Garb, that was very similar to Dramper, but it relied on Espeon for the main damage dealing. Psybeam was a nice one energy poke that confused Pokemon, Psychic had the potential to do big damage, and Divide GX was absolutely ridiculous for wrecking evolution decks. Eventually, Espeon and Dramper even merged to become one deck. Doesn't quite stop there though, because Yveltal Guard was a serious force to be reckoned with. Yveltal EX would load up for massive X-Ball damage or use Wise Cyclones to preserve energy, which would two-shot everything in format. To make it even scarier, there were two baby Yveltals that were played at the same time. One of them had Oblivion Wing, which would provide a solid poke damage 30 and accelerate energy from the discard pile. But Fright Night Yveltal was a very scary card too. Pitch Black Spear would do 60 damage to the active and then 60 damage to a benched EX. All while turning off tool cards whilst in the active as well. This would single-handedly disrupt Mega Evolution decks by turning off their Spirit Link. And I'm sure there are many more Garbodor decks that I've forgotten about, but you get the point. Looking at the ability lock we've seen from Pokemon since, it just hasn't been the same as Garbodor. Tinglu is okay, but it relies on getting damage into play first to get the ability lock. And while this might not be the hardest thing in the world to do when you got cards like Hawlucha and Gapejaw Bug in format, and even Tinglu's own attack Land Scoop helps out with this, it's still a bit more of a faff. And since Tinglu's ability doesn't even work on opposing EX cards, your opponent can just evolve out of the lock and then they can get to work. Garbodor's turning in his grave looking at that one, oh my goodness.
Hexmaniac was a completely different kind of ability lock. It was a supporter card that would turn off abilities until your next turn. So strong it got banned.
This essentially worked in a similar way to Zoro Garb, where you would use all your abilities like Set Up, Steam Up or Dragonite's Pull Up ability, then play a Hexmaniac to deny all your opponent those juicy abilities too. Very gross. And in a format with Shaman EX, where you could just, shaman away, you could actually get away with using Hexmaniac on consecutive turns. What made this even scarier was that it existed at the same time as VS Seeker, which would let you get a support or a card from a discard pile and put it back into your hand. This made it much easier to use Hexmaniac on consecutive turns. For example, one of the strongest decks I've ever seen was Hex March. This is a deck where you would utilize Night March attackers to deal out massive damage. You would turbo through your deck at crazy speed with Shaman, Acrobike and Trainer's Mail, so you get all your Night Marchers in the discard pile, so you were hitting for 1-hit KO numbers. But just before you attack, you would play a Hexmaniac. This meant you were taking a 2-prize knockout with a 1-prizer in the active, and you left your opponent with no abilities. This meant even if they could reload and attack, they were only taking 1 prize card. And more times than not, the ability lock would actually brick your opponent right there and then, making them lose the game. Now, I'll go out on a limb here and say we will never get a card like Hexmaniac again. I also don't think we'll ever get a card like Garbodor again, because it will just be too strong and too deadly for some decks to deal with.
Right, so I know what you're thinking. Yes, we've had an item lock since, very good, but it wasn't as good as Seismitoad EX. Trust me. Let me tell you why.
Seismitoad EX was released in the Furious Fist expansion, and I immediately knew we were all in trouble. For 1 DC attachment, you could do Quaking Punch, stopping your opponent from playing any item cards, and doing 30 damage. Now that 30 damage sounds very low. However, when you consider that 180 was the magic number, 30 wasn't starting to look so bad, especially with Verbank City Gym and Hypnotoxic Laser combo, getting an extra 30 damage from poison and 50% of the time leaving your opponent asleep too. Muscle Band existed at the same time, boosting that damage by 20. So now that lowly Quaking Punch has gone from 30 damage all the way to 80 damage in total. That was pretty much 2-shotting opponents with item lock too. I cannot really explain to you how strong Seismitoad was if he wasn't playing back then. It would strike fear in the hearts of everyone. Super Scoop Up existed too, so you could completely heal your Seismitoad on a coin flip. The amount of Toad variants that existed back in the day was obscene. So let's do a quick speed run of them. Toad Bats was basically Quaking Punch plus extra damage from Sneaky and Surprise Bite respectively. Got a bit naughty. 2nd place at Worlds. Toad Aqua Box. Toad plus Manaphy to have free retreat and max elixir to threaten grenade hammers to close out games. You even had Rough Seals to start healing Seismitoads too. Seismitoad Red Card. This was actually a deck I created, funnily enough. You would fire off red cards turn 1 and then immediately item lock your opponent out the game.
So if you thought just being ability locked was bad, Seismitoad Garbodor would ability lock and item lock at the same time, making those late games ends to 2 and 1 very, very, very deadly.
I could go on and on and on, but trust me, I guarantee we will never see another basic Pokemon that item locks for 1 energy attachment with relevant damage ever again. You can hold me to that too. Vileplume was a different style of item lock. It needed much more of your deck tailored around it for it to be effective, like a full 4-4-3 line for example. But it did something Toad couldn't do. It could item lock your opponent before they could even play a single card. Now actually sit down and think about that for a second. Toad's got their opening hand, you have your opening hand, you put your basic down and your opponent starts to play. They spam loads of cards like Ultra Ball, Level Ball, Shamans, and then they find their copy of Forest of Giant Plants. This lets Grass type evolve on the first turn they were played, and they can evolve again. This means if your opponent could find Oddish, Gloom, and Vileplume, the irritating pollen ability would activate, meaning both players could no longer play any item cards. Meaning you were pretty much out of luck. And I don't think we'll ever see a turn 1 item lock combo released ever again. Now I know what you're thinking again. We already have this with Squawkabilly. So you're wrong, Bert. You're wrong. This has been printed again. Well, no, actually you're wrong. Let me tell you why. Shaman EX and Uxie were the OG draw cards when you bench them cards. Uxie let you draw up to 7 and Shaman let you draw up to 6. This would let you get away with playing much less draw supporters, since Shaman could draw you the cards, meaning you could now play more powerful supporters that didn't draw you cards, like Hexmaniac from earlier for example. This reliance on Shaman EX made the full art price of the card go all the way up to £90, really pricing some people out of playing certain decks. Right, so how does Shaman and Uxie differ from Squawkabilly or even Crobat, for example, then, eh? Pretty simple. You could use multiple Shaman EX in a turn. Dark Asset had that extra bit of text that would make sure you could only use one Crobat via turn. Dedenne was the same, and poor Squawkabilly can only be used on your first turn. So I will bet you my shoelaces we will never see a basic Pokemon that when you bench it you can draw cards and you can use multiple of them in a turn again. Just not going to happen. Now this is the card that saddens me the most, thinking that we will categorically never see it again. Dusknoir was released in the Boundaries Crossed expansion, and it had the ability Sinister Hand. This would let you move around damage counters on your opponent's side of the board. This doesn't sound too insane, right? Well, you see, this is really ripe for some absolute abuse. You see, there was a dirty combo you would play that would literally stop your opponent from doing anything until they lost the game. This combo started off by using Azelcor's attack, deck and cover. This did 50 and paralyzed and poisoned your opponent for 1 DCE attachment. And while it did shuffle itself away back into the deck, making it quite annoying to use again, you could just use Mew EX to copy the attack, meaning all you had to do then was find 1 copy of Mew EX and a DCE to keep the loop going turn after turn, keeping your opponent paralyzed. This is all well and good, but couldn't your opponent just play a switch and then they could start taking KOs? Well, you see, that would be true, except you would then promote Gothitelle after the Mew shuffled itself away, and Gothitelle's ability Magic Room stopped your opponent from playing any items while it was in the active. This locked off pretty much all way of your opponents being able to move it around the active. So now you can see how this loop worked, but what would happen if your opponent's active eventually gets KO'd? Won't they then get a free turn to get a hit in? Well, that would be true again, but this is where our old friend Dusknoir would come in, you see. With his ability Sinister Hand, you would move all the damage off their active onto any one of their bench Pokemon. This would allow you to keep the loop up indefinitely and win the game with normally a big 6 prize turn. There was even a more aggressive version of the deck that would play a heavy Flygon with the ability Sand Slammer, which would put 1 damage counters on all your opponent's Pokemon in between turns, giving you a potential 120 damage to play with Dusknoir every turn. Madness. A Dusknoir deck even managed to get all the way to 11th place at the 2014 World Championships with Mia Violet at the helm, who played it with Darkrai EX and Yveltal EX too. So why won't this style card ever come back now then? Well, you see, the problem would be is, let's say you hit a Charizard EX for 210 damage. You now instantly have a way to KO 3 Charmanders immediately, pretty much stopping your opponent from ever being able to recover and play the game moving forward. And this would also get around cards like Manaphy or anything else of that nature. It's such a shame because I absolutely adore playing Dusknoir with cards like Empoleon and Miltank, but it's pretty safe to say we will never, ever get it again. And if you like this video, why don't you watch this one here, which is all about the forgotten but very strong archetypes in the Pokemon TCG.